the plan of action, but is one that has enormous potential and it is underutilized at the moment. We have this forum, the India-Africa Forum, the Arab States, Latin America. We have all those instances. But I remember very well in 2 or 3 of these spaces, we were contacted to see if we could give content to those spaces. So the potential they have to become more active elements and instruments of South-South cooperation is significant. In addition, the contribution of the established regional organizations, many of which are by definition South-South entities, but they are not very well engineered in many cases to do intra-South-South cooperation and be even weaker to do South-South cooperation with other regional or inter-regional organizations. And then we have the global dimension that can include the UN and others, because the 9th point is the institutional setup within the UN. And there's a big debate. The interesting thing is that the UN was created as a mechanism to do North-South cooperation. I'm talking about the UN development system. But I tell you that my office every year prepares the report of the Secretary General on the work of the UN system on South-South cooperation. 3 years ago, we got feedback from 9 UN organizations. This year, we got feedback from 30. So it is becoming part of the UN modalities of collaboration, and I think it's up to us from inside and from you member states from the outside to get the UN more engaged as a facilitator and promoter of South-South cooperation, and also how to scale up the institutional framework within the United Nations. That is the 9th issue. And the 10th, the last one, is the next steps. Because as you see, I mostly concentrated on trying to get an inventory of what has happened, and also try to get some agreement on where we are. But I think Buenos Aires should serve as a space for us to define how to move these modalities of cooperation forward to achieve the 2030 agenda and other agendas. So that is the challenge. I have some ideas, but I just wanted to basically at this stage put the issues on the table. And if your thinking or your work help us make contributions for the discussions of the member states along these lines, in addition to what you said during these days, which we noted, will be very welcome to receive it, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jorge Shadek, for your comments. And I think as some of the experts who are following different platforms would have realized, the debates at the global level are converging. And they are converging to an extent that the issues that you find reflecting in WTO, coming up in G20, it's also running across the UN agencies, to which most of the governments of the South are not tuned to. Within the developed countries, OECD plays that role extremely well, but South has yet to put the act together. And it is the responsibility of some of the think tanks, the research institutions across the South, to get the governments on one page. And I'm so glad today that the next 3 speakers in this panel is an effort in that direction. We have Mr. Alok Dimri, who has been holding the Indian flag high with the BRICS summit, but he is also responsible for India, Brazil, South Africa, and also Sue Sherpa at the G20 process, and being head of the Multilateral Economic Relations Division, also provides input to various economic issues within the Ministry of External Affairs. We are also joined here by somebody who has a distinctive service all across in terms of how the narrative from the finance side is shaped. He is our Sherpa at G20. He was also Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs. I have already introduced Professor Muchkund Dubey to you. But to three of them who could not join us in any of the sessions earlier, there are 5 points that I want to bring to their attention, and I'm thankful to Jorge for bringing out the key elements of our discussion. But the 5 points that I feel are extremely important here for us as we move forward are as follows. One is in terms of the session that we just discussed, the plurality and the heterogeneity of South-South cooperation. The fact that the Palestine International Cooperation Agency, PICA, participated and very categorically mentioned that no country is poor enough not to give anything, and we still have something to give, though we are going through so much of distress. So the interventions and the presentations by PICA is a clear testimony to this very idea of South-South cooperation, of sharing even with limited resources. It's also important in terms of passing on the message of self-reliance in terms of how we are moving forward. The fact that PICA could extend assistance in Ecuador and in the several list of countries that we heard this morning, this afternoon, I think is again a testimony in terms of how structured cooperation of South-South cooperation can move forward. Second point is about the idea of the larger global scenario that we are witnessing, and as Professor Amitav Acharya, who delivered the keynote address at the conference, mentioned, the world is moving towards a multiplex, which would have no hegemon, but at the same time would have cultural and political diversity, which would get reflected in the diversity at the level of functionality. And this, I think, is important as we are talking about data reporting, as we are talking about impact assessment, and as we are talking about several other ideas. The third point is in terms of the very idea of the theoretical framework. So the fact that we have delivered South-South cooperation, but as we mentioned, after all, Prebisk and Professor Muchkund Dubey has rightly reminded us of Samir Amin. After them, the efforts by the Southern scholars in terms of documenting and interpreting a theoretical framework for South-South cooperation with these factors being built in is still to be seen, and that's the objective of the NEST, which RIS is hosting, the network of Southern think tanks. The fourth point is in terms of how the sectoral diversity, and we had several sessions focusing on health, science, technology, agriculture, trade and investment, where we have captured the sectoral specificities, and they bring in their own take. So the duty-free, quota-free access and many other such programs of various governments, they are important at that level. The fifth and the last point is in terms of the idea going beyond G2G. And this has become reality of how we are going beyond government to government partnerships, the CSOs. We had this morning breakfast meeting with FIDC and NEST, and the idea came up in terms of how we are going to go forward in terms of putting in this agenda at the G20 level and at many other platforms where development finance is being discussed. The idea of sustainable development goals and of development finance are squarely responsible in terms of how we move forward in terms of addressing the Agenda 2030. So with this background, I would now like to invite our three speakers. First would be the Joint Secretary in Multilateral Economic Relations Division, Mr. Alok Dimri.
Thank you, Professor Chaturvedi, and good afternoon to all. And I'm honored to be part of the distinguished panel, and also to my preceding speakers for having framed this discussion in a comprehensive manner. Just by value of an additional dimension, I thought that it would be useful to bring in the element of the context of multilateralism that we are facing at the moment, because essentially the global agenda and the narrative, we heard the narrative, the northern narrative, the southern narrative, and the global narrative on the development cooperation that where is that contextualized in today's multilateral context? There was a reference to cooperation between the local government and the governance elements as well. There also, again, perhaps it would be wise to link it up to the current mood of multilateralism, the engagement between nation to nation and the agencies, that before we realistically think about cooperation amongst the entities which are subnational or the local. Before any of that, I think, without looking at the notes, I think there's a little beginning, and I think South has always believed in that a narrative not necessarily has to be a comprehensive and a humongous narrative. It is a little beginning which started with the Delhi dialogue, and I'm sure it was more with an afterthought that today we call it Delhi Dialogue 4, because there was a need felt among the southern development operators and cooperators that there is a narrative which is not actualized. There was something happening, and that doesn't find its place in the global narrative. And that brought the southern practitioners together. And I won't say I'm delighted, but I'm definitely happy that today we are hosting the Delhi 4 dialogue. And by and large, we have mapped the terrain. Now, it is not a discovery for truth. All global narratives are conducted in the context of a power structure, a power equation. And southern cooperation, development cooperation, north and south, it's not that it operates in a vacuum where the south has the equal felicity to onboard its agenda as the north. And perhaps that's where there was a reference that there is a need to institutionalize the southern narrative, or perhaps a matching institutional mechanism on this side. Again, I would say that NEST, FIDC, and the Delhi 4 dialogue has helped us, afforded us a platform that some of us can come together, share our notes and the orientations, and look at the ongoing context, the narrative at the moment, the global discourse. And by many definitions, I think it at a critical juncture. I wouldn't say critical as critical, because the critical situation is somewhere else today. You know, it's at the WTO, it's at the trade, it's at the tariffs, it's at the flow, exchange, literally. The criticality today is at the exchange of things, be it the funds and the people and the technology on the exchanges, ideas. And the cooperation, the development cooperation, it doesn't pale in that light, but it stands out at a reality, and I say that with a very distinct consciousness of something we do in BRICS. That South-South cooperation is not only that you stand at a vantage and then you capture it from that vantage, and then you call it a definition, you call it a framework, you call it an impact, you call it a metrics, you call it measuring it and sizing it and quantifying it. You do all that. But are we realistic that there will be something called South-South cooperation that will happen, and that is happening, that is gaining, multiplying in proportions? And I think India-Africa Summit is only part of that. And there are other southern development narratives which are becoming part of it. So obviously the landscape, if not confusing, but it is getting populated, really populated. And in that context, perhaps one would say that the ongoing dialogue at the UN is at an important juncture, but there is much that is also happening within it and outside it. But not to say that BAPA plus 40 is at an important juncture today, and UN had an important event. We are looking forward to the next event in March, and then the high-level event next year, which has a special focus. I don't think there's much of a necessity at the moment to touch upon the sustainable development goals and linking it up to that aspect of development cooperation. But the fact that there is an observation that is needed in terms of the ability of the South vis-a-vis the ability of the North to mainstream its agenda, to control the agenda. And when we say at the United Nations also, I think many of those forces are at play yes, it's good to say that G77, which is about what, 134 today? It is by majority the community of the nations, but the mechanism that they operate with hasn't decided to reform itself to keep it updated with the changing times. And on the other hand, you did hear that OECD has the orientation to give primacy to the financial flows and to the measurement of impact assessment. Another gaping hole that we thought from after practicing, we are not the theorists of this craft, which we thought that somehow the South-South cooperation discourse is not linked very well with the formal developmental discourse of ODA or the North-South part of it. So somehow, whenever the voluntary nature of it doesn't come about that sharply. The fact that there is an element of obligation to development cooperation, the fact that there is a voluntary and solidarity notion element of cooperation attached to it. Now, that doesn't come up before we get into the formal theorizing of it, which Jorge very aptly linked up in terms of the legitimacy and the theory and the definition and the actors. I think also at some stage one will have to look at it in terms of the number of actors who do or contribute, and the others who try to be part of it, shape it, intellectualize it, or try to gain control on the narrative. Now, that is normal, that would happen in any international discourse, but the fact is that it does burden somewhere the actors of the South-South cooperation, because essentially at one level, this